There, we can start. Yeah, it looks pretty full. Okay, welcome to our event today on the implications of the new US trade policy by the incoming President Trump. It's a great pleasure to host today Adam Posen, President of the Peterson Institute in Washington. Peterson Institute is a nonpartisan economic think tank that has been very much now in the front battle line on some of these trade discussions that are ongoing in Washington and around the world. I think you had the pleasure, if I may say so, of being labeled by Wilbur Ross and Peter Navarro in a blog post as a shameless defender of globalization.
Yeah, they called us nastier something of globalism.
Nasty defender of globalism. So Adam and his team have published a few pieces on comparing the implications of the trade agenda of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump ahead of the elections for what we could know they would be. And of course, we already knew quite a number of things. There were some papers published, especially by Navarro and Ross, that actually lay down quite a number of issues as regards the thinking of the incoming new U.S. administration. And I would argue that some of the reaction in Europe, in some European media, in particular, that everything is unknown and everything is totally erratic that is coming out of the U.S. administration is not quite right. There is some system behind it, and I think we will talk about, what is the underlying logic behind it and what then are the implications of all of this. So again, thank you, Adam, for being here with us today. The idea is to have Adam speak first for 15 minutes, around 15 minutes. We would then turn to Kang Yu from the Chinese mission, First Secretary for Commerce. Thank you very much for coming. Of course, China is a big player in all of this, and you may have seen the speech by President Xi in Davos, which was widely reported on, and of course the irony that the Chinese president is defending the liberal global economic trading order could not be escaped. So I think this is something we will certainly also talk about, and I'm very glad that you come here today and share a bit of the flavor of President Xi's speech with us. Finally, of course, well known to all of us in the room, Andre Sapir, our senior fellow, will give his thoughts to what he has heard. Andre is one of the most prominent trade experts in Europe, and so thank you also to you, Andre, for being here. Okay, so I think without much further ado, Adam, let me give the floor to you, and we look forward to your speech.
Well, no, thank you, Gunther. My thanks to Gunther and the Bruegel team for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming out today. As will become evident, or may already be evident, I am not a member of the Trump administration. I am not an advisor to the Trump administration. Joking aside, this leads to a very clear disclaimer. I am giving you my honest interpretation based on both public statements and contacts with senior officials and people who are close to the Trump administration and very small amount of direct contact. But I am, I could be wrong in many ways, always, but particularly about what they're doing. But I'm going to give you our best guess as to what's going on and what it means. So let me dive right in. I think the first thing one has to say is I think it's important to take what they've been saying at face value. In other words, they are going to do what they say they're going to do. There is a great deal of chatter, particularly in the markets, to the effect of this is all just posturing, they will be reasonable. There is a great deal of backroom chatter of some, including some Trump nominees, going to various influential people and saying, look, we're business people, this is just posturing ahead of a negotiation. We're going to bargain and get the best we can, but we're not going to blow things up. Now, compared to the alternative, I would be very happy if that were the case. I don't think that would be the case. The convictions expressed by the people closest to the president-elect, including by the president-elect, no one is closer to the president-elect than himself, show a worldview that and has been expressed in some detail, a worldview that is fundamentally antithetical to the liberal trading order. It is one that believes that bilateral deals are superior to multilateral deals, that believes that the system, which most of us think was set up by the U.S. and enlightened self-interest and in various ways tilted to benefit the U.S., close paren, the system is biased fundamentally against the U.S., that the U.S. has been exploited for decades, that trade deficits are in and of themselves bad. It is not conditional on the source of the trade deficit, the size of the trade deficit, the size of the country, the nature of the deficit. Trade deficits are themselves bad and should be a target of policy. That industrial policy aimed at restoring dirty, older manufacturing industries should be a priority of the administration. That the ability of an American government, particularly an American government populated by smart deal makers, to bully or threaten or cajole other governments into giving concessions consistent with those previous statements is high were it to be used and is worth using, and has been said, as has been said repeatedly, including, I believe, by Mr. Trump's representative at Davos 2 days ago, if there was a trade war with China, Mexico, whoever, they would suffer more than we would. Now, again, you can say this is all just posturing, but this kind of posturing has to, at some level, believe that the multilateral system is not delivering and that bilateral bullying is useful, because otherwise, why bother? And secondly, we have seen repeatedly in the appointments made by, or the nominations made by Mr. Trump and the statements he has made and his closest advisors have made, that they are not pretending this is just a stance. Now, the second point to be made is, of course, on the economics, this is all completely false. On the facts, this is all completely false as analysis of the situation. Trade deficits are not inherently bad. Bilateral deals are highly inefficient. The main virtue of trade deals is to open up your own economy so that your companies and your technologies are put to under competitive pressure, and your consumers have maximum choice and buying power, and so on and so on. We should not, as with so many other things, including human rights issues, foreign policy issues, issues of vaccination, issues of climate change, we should not pretend that simply because the president says it and certain people find it convenient to talk about it and be happy with the president, make the president happy with them, that these are viable statements. They are not. They are false. They are demonstrably false. However, we do live in a somewhat, at least we hope temporarily, post-fact world, and that is the worldview of the people coming into office. What does this mean in practical terms? I must admit that I was taken quite by surprise by the anti-EU sentiments expressed by Mr. Trump in the, was it Die Welt on Sunday? Not because I didn't think he sort of thought that way, and not because he's not aligned with people who sound like Brexiteers, but because he has been so intent on China and Mexico that it was surprising to me he turned so quickly on the EU. This is a case where I think this was just him sort of getting into it and expressing his true feelings, but not his true priorities. I think the reality is that he will not engage in a direct conflict with China immediately. I think that he will not engage in a direct conflict with the WTO immediately. My forecast is, however, that he will continue to ramp up direct pressure on Mexico. This is for several reasons. There's obviously a racist group of voters who supported him who dislike Mexico and Mexicans. There is, without necessarily imputing racist motives, there is a group of people in the U.S. who believe that the U.S. has been completely, they would use the term screwed over by Mexico and are very scared of Mexican migration, even though, again, an inconvenient fact, Mexican migration has been declining for many years to the U.S., and NAFTA helped the decline. Again, leave that aside. And I think most of all, Mr. Trump's team is likely to go after Mexico first because in their way of thinking about things, this is a weaker trading partner that we can bully, and we can have a demonstration effect that if we can push on Mexico, we will get more support internally and we can show this kind of approach has benefits. As my colleagues, including Monica de Bola, Pedro da Costa, and a number of others at the Peterson Institute have discussed, this is, Bill Klein, this is not going to work even in the small sense because, as we've seen, every time Mr. Trump threatens Mexico, it drives down the value of the peso against the Mexican dollar. If you control for how the Mexican peso has done versus how similar emerging markets have done against the dollar in this period, arguably, Mr. Trump has driven down the Mexican peso 15% versus baseline, roughly. That's a very big number. It's not good for Mexico, but it also means that if you're concerned about the bilateral trade deficit with Mexico, which again, you should not care about, but if you are caring about that, you are making the bilateral trade deficit expand rather than contract. And so this will likely lead to even more aggressive actions by Mr. Trump. The scenario which I am, in a sense, most concerned about is how this plays out over a few years. My belief, now many people share this belief, and I'm worried we're all group thinking, but anyway, my belief is that the dollar will continue to rise, trade-weighted, but especially against the economies that Mr. Trump attacks. This will already is baked in from past divergences in growth rates and interest rates, and that assuming he does a very large fiscal expansion, which seems to be the case, in fact, will be the case, the Federal Reserve will likely accelerate its pace of interest rate rises, so the dollar will continue to rise. Again, to cite my colleague Bill Klein, his semi-annual forecasts of trade deficits suggested, and exchange rates suggested that the U.S. will double its trade deficit to 4% of GDP or more by 2020. That is based on the exchange rate movements and the Federal Reserve movements prior to the election. So that's already baked in. If we get additional dollar strength, additional provocations from Mr. Trump, additional divergent, unsustainable fiscal boom Fed growth in the U.S., that trade deficit will widen further, potentially to 6% of GDP. Again, some of you have heard me say this before, but I think it bears repeating. The U.S. is not Greece or Argentina. There is no fundamental stability problem with a 6% of GDP trade deficit. It is, however, a large number, even by U.S. standards. The previous height of the trade deficit in normal times was in the mid-'80s when we had a similar macro policy mix, and the trade deficit topped out at something over 5% of GDP. And that was, of course, the time at which Congress most backed protectionist measures in the U.S. in recent decades. And so the concern is not so much that right out of the box he immediately resorts to a trade war, but that he does things, says, well, we have to see what happens, and then knowingly or unknowingly, you see a trade deficit that's much larger by the second half of his term, and he reacts with far more punitive results. Given the distinguished colleagues who I'm grateful have come, and I'm grateful to Guntram for arranging, let me just say very briefly in the 3 minutes I have left, something about U.S.-China and something about U.S.-EU. There are legitimate concerns between the U.S. and China on various trade issues, and there are issues where the U.S. and EU have common issues with China. However, these all fall into the category, in my view, of normal trade disputes that can be handled through negotiation as well as through the WTO process if necessary. This includes issues such as the protection of intellectual property rights, overcapacity in steel and aluminum, various restrictions on types of foreign direct investment. However, again, these are real issues, and there are issues, sorry, forget the however, and there are genuine concerns going to the market economy status issue about what is the extent of state-owned enterprises in China. However, here's where the however comes in, several points. First, direct confrontation with China is unlikely to resolve these issues. It is likely to exacerbate these issues. Second, none of these issues is sufficiently significant that they are worthy of the disruption that a trade war or extended trade battles would cause. Third, China, at least a significant part of China's leadership, and I don't pretend to interpret that very far, but at least a significant part of China's leadership rightly views some of these liberalization efforts through trade and international commerce as in China's own self-interest, and that is how the U.S. has made the most progress with China. Fourthly, the biggest problem that China had in terms of being aggressive against U.S. interests or the rest of the world in economics, let me be very clear, this is specifically economics, I'm not touching security. In economics was the period from 2005 to 2008 when the Chinese government engaged in very large-scale exchange rate intervention. I would call it manipulation, and the U.S. government should have been more aggressive in addressing it at that time. However, like some of the nonsense Mr. Trump said about Japan during the campaign and said about China during the campaign, this is things that are in the past. China has been intervening to support its currency for the last 18 months. Again, you all know this, but let us be very clear. China has abided by the letter and the spirit of the G20 agreements that took place over the last couple of years about non-unilateral intervention. This is now going on 9 years since they last did massive intervention. Again, it is in China's own interest not to be engaged in that kind of intervention, as well as the US, but the fact is they've recognized that. So the study that Guntram kindly referred to that we put out from the Peters Institute by Gary Huffbauer, Marcus Nola, and Sherman Robinson went through, as we said, the Clinton and the Trump policies. I'm very proud of this study. We published in September. It's available on our website, PIIE.com. Anyway, but the main message of this study is that this talk about a trade war or even just simple retaliation is very, very costly. And I have no doubt that ultimately, if you engage in a terrible trade war, that the US would be less damaged than China or Mexico or whoever. But as President Xi pointed out at Davos, and as we pointed out some months ago, the US would be very badly harmed. It would gain nothing from this. And the people who would be harmed would be the working people of the US across a wide range of industries, across a wide range of regions. It would take the form of elevated temporary unemployment. It would take the form of huge rise in costs of consumer goods. It would take the form of large-scale displacement, and it would go across the economy. It wouldn't be just, oh, they're not buying our soybeans. It would be Las Vegas would lose a huge amount of tourism business, not just from China, but from high-skilled American workers who would be out of jobs. We've modeled this. This is all on the website. The data is there. You can put in a zip code or a county in the US and see what the impact would be of a trade war with China. So there are issues to dispute. The approach that the Trump people are seemingly inclined to take is, in my view, highly mistaken and highly dangerous. Finally, US-EU. So the flip side of all this is we do have this ongoing issue of steel, coal, aluminum, but of particularly steel overcapacity in the world. There are a number of EU governments who are very concerned about this. They're arguably much more exposed to this than than the US. With the EU companies and the US companies being at pretty much the technological frontier in many industries, we have a very large common interest in IPR. So there are issues where US and EU could collaborate on China, and if Mr. Trump is to be played or mitigated in some sense by EU representatives, it is possible that the right strategy is to emphasize these issues. Now, I'm of very mixed feelings about this. I think it would be understandable. I think it would also be WTO compatible and could result in some constructive outcomes. I am uncomfortable with the idea of the US and EU in some sense ganging up on China. I am uncomfortable with feeding Mr. Trump's administration on the idea that this kind of conflictual approach is the right way to go. If it was done, say, in the OECD process on steel, that's one thing. If it's done of, yes, we're with you against the dastardly whatever, I'm a little less. The issue will be, of course, that the EU, and like the US and like all of us, is very dependent on the rules-based international order. And I am currently not forecasting an immediate US withdrawal from the WTO or direct huge violations of those rules. But there is clearly a very big risk there. And so it does become a very difficult strategic issue, even if Mr. Trump and his administration, President-elect Trump and his administration, choose to not go after the EU and go after Mexico or China or whoever instead. And so this gets us into very interesting strategic and I would argue moral questions. And it is a very real question whether the right approach is to sort of just stall and hope that Mr. Trump is an aberration, or that, as I said at the start, as some people are advertising, that this is simply a show and that in reality he will be much less destructive. That's one option. Another option is to flip around what I just said, which is to align with China and various emerging markets. Again, I think there's good and bad ways of doing this. I think it is entirely legitimate, appropriate, and probably constructive for China and Europe to get together and say, we like the rules-based system that exists. We will hold the US accountable to the rules-based system. And importantly, and this applies to both China and the EU, we will abide by the rules-based system even more than we did in the past because we have to be the ones who support it and put our money where our mouth is because the US is going to free ride. I think that is a perfectly reasonable and constructive way to go, and there are very specific implications. The destructive scenario, of course, is sort of if you take the Airbus-Boeing model and apply it to the entire scope of economic issues. That China, perhaps not even intentionally, but as the beneficiary of a division between the EU and the US, has the US and EU bidding against each other. This is obviously not the ideal way to go. Now, there's a delicate dance here. My colleague Fred Bergstrom from the Peterson Institute is a big believer in what he has termed competitive liberalization. And so if the EU concludes an agreement with Canada at the same time the US is messing up NAFTA, if the EU concludes agreements in Asia at the same time the US is forestalling TPP, in a sense that's fine. And nothing may wake up a congressman or congresswoman to the folly of their ways, then, aha, the Europeans, the Chinese are diverting trade that should be ours. The trick is to do that in a way that is constructive rather than destructive, which will be my closing point. As Luigi Zingales, among others, has written, if you're dealing with a Berlusconi or a Mussolini type, don't get caught up in saying, oh, this person is outside the pale, or oh, can you believe what he's doing now, or he's corrupt. That may all be true, but that ultimately, in my opinion, is not going to win the day. So don't fight fire with fire, fight fire with water. You have to go forward in a constructive way, and it's now the EU and China's turn to lead instead of the US, and God willing, you will save us all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Adam. So China, is China going to save us? What do you think?
Okay, please. Yeah. So it's my great pleasure to be here to share my views with all of you. And thank you, Mr. Posen, for your analysis on the possibility in the future for Mr. Trump's trade policy. But I'm afraid, since you're based in Washington, maybe you know more about Mr. Trump. But in my opinion, I do think that we can use four keywords to describe the future. One is uncertain, another is difficult, and also confusing, and the last one is the solution for cooperation. As for uncertain, I suppose we have to clarify what Mr. Trump has said during the campaign and what he's thinking now, and also what he can do in the future. So there are three different things. So we are not sure, we are uncertain, and maybe Mr. Trump is not uncertain for what he can do in the future too, because America is a very sophisticated democratic country and has very good balance and check system. So a single presidency cannot go radical in any area. So I suppose that is why I'm confident in the future. But as for difficult means, so it seems that Mr. Trump has many objectives, but all these objectives, from a single objective, it will be perfect. For example, to cut corporate tax and to increase infrastructure investment and to challenge China, challenge Mexico. So from every point, if we judge from one perspective, it's perfect. But when we combine, we found it's almost mission impossible because Mr. Trump is challenging almost all over the world. So as for TPP, if he killed TPP, in my understanding, TPP is a geopolitical product. So that, Japan and some other American allies in Asia will not be happy. And as for NAFTA, Canada and Mexico won't be very angry, right? And also, so now we touch on US-EU relations. So I suppose EU now is a little upset, right? So as for the WTO and the world system, so I suppose Mr. Trump won't make everyone, almost make everyone unhappy, right? So his policy will be very, very difficult to implement in the future. And even for the strong US dollars, if Mr. Trump would like to, to cut tax and also increase fiscal expenditure, so how about where is the debt ceiling in the future? So, not easy. Another key word is confusing. Confused means, so I don't know if Mr. Trump has a very clear picture for its economic rationale and political considerations. So for example, if Mr. Trump would like to withdraw from Asia Pacific, just because he said TPP, we cannot accept a TPP, but TPP is a geopolitical product. So maybe, in many people's eyes, China will feel more comfortable with this. And in EU, he said NATO is outdated. So maybe Russia will be more happier. So, so how to compare its economic rationale and the political consideration? I don't know if Mr. Trump has a very clear picture in himself. So that's a little confusing. Yeah. So the last point is cooperation. And so as President Xi said in Davos, China is one of the greatest beneficiaries of globalization, and we do think globalization should go on no matter what kind of difficulties we face. But the problem now is that United States, it is United States which created the present international system. And this system make United States strong after World War II until now. So China is a latecomer, and we are trying to learn these international rules. But the problem is that when we try to learn and we try to be in the international system and we are going to follow these rules, United States tell us, oh no, these rules is not good, we want to change. So let's change. So, I mean, Mr. Trump, I personally believe that Mr. Trump would like to change the present system and the international rules. That's okay. But the way he's doing is to put some high pressure on all of the stakeholders. 45 tariff on China, 35 tariff on German cars, and also on Mexico.
From Mexico,
So, yes.
not from Germany.
So he will have very high pressure on all these partners. I suppose maybe in the future, he just use such kind of pressure to force these partners to be in the negotiated table. So for example, psychologically, if we analyze his thinking psychologically, we think, as for China, 45 tariff, oh my God. So we will think, may we negotiate for 20% or 30%, we will feel comfortable or something. So that's to say, Mr. Trump himself, maybe he does not expect to have so much as he has promised in his campaign, but he just forced all the partners to be in the negotiated table to have such kind of compromise. So I do suppose there is no winner for trade war between China and the US, or China and EU, or US and EU. So the best way is for us to sit down and to negotiate, to find a solution. The solution lies in cooperation. I mean, for example, we know China and the EU and China and the US are negotiating bilateral investment treaty, and also EU and the US are negotiating TTIP. So if we cannot reach the worldwide liberalization under WTO framework, maybe we can do it from the regional on bilateral level first. So that's the pragmatic way. And what's more, and China, to be frank, I personally believe that China is a weaker partner in U.S. International scenario. So I do think that China will not challenge United States directly on geopolitical issues or on trade issues. We would like to cooperate with the United States and also to negotiate to reach an agreement which is acceptable for all of us. But maybe this process will be very difficult, but it deserves time. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Andre, please.
Thank you. Pleasure to be able to comment on Adam's presentation. Let me say first that I agreed with everything that you said. And in particular, I think you put it very well at the end of your presentation about the choices, what you thought were the choices for the EU. Fight fire with fire or with water. Should we, thinking about China, the three large elephants in the room as far as trade is concerned, as far as economy is concerned, should we ally with China in a sense, in an aggressive manner vis-à-vis the US, or should we ally with China to uphold the rules-based system? I think that is indeed the right question. So let me tell you what I think on this and on related matters that you discuss, and what is it that I would advise the EU to do. We will have here next week Commissioner Malmström who will discuss her view about where trade policy stands for the EU at the moment, and I'm sure that the US development will obviously very prominent in the discussion. So number one, I would advise and will advise to the EU to indeed be the defender, the champion of multilateralism. Not necessarily of globalization, but of multilateralism. I think that is indeed both in terms of values and in terms of interests what the EU needs to do. Now, to be the defender of multilateralism and of a rules-based system doesn't mean that some of the rules that exist today may not need to evolve. We are in the 21st century, and I think one of the sad things about the Doha round having been stuck is that most people were thinking about the Doha round in terms of the liberalization side of the WTO's work, which I think is not the most important part. The most important part of the rules-based system are precisely the rules, not the liberalization. And precisely at the time when there is tension between countries, and in particular with big countries, that's when the rules are most important. But those rules, maybe some of those rules, they need to be changed, they need to be improved. Some rules do not exist. Both of you have mentioned investment. Okay? We do not have global rules on investment. Yes, we are discussing bilaterally with China, with other countries, about rules. That was part, obviously, also of the discussion with Canada. I think it would be much better, and that has been actually the EU position, if we could have a multilateral system and with rules for investment. So yes, I would say that the EU should play that role and should indeed discuss with China, with other countries, with India, a number of other partners, not in a sense in an unfriendly manner to the United States, but to say maybe at the moment the United States is not able to play that role, but that role is important. They will be live after the current presidency, and we don't want to get off track. It should be a temporary discussion, a temporary position, but we should not take position ourselves that will make the entire system derail from where we have been. So that's number one. Need to be the defender of the rules-based multilateral system, and indeed take your option of fighting a fire with water and not with fire. Point number two, the EU has interests also, and not just values and principles, it has also interests. And as far as the United States government may take measures, and I follow what you said, first with respect to Mexico, that may harm some EU firms' interests. And we should definitely signal to the United States that our interests are being jeopardized, and that even though we want to defend the rules-based system in general, when it comes to our specific interests, we will not remain inactive. That we should not tolerate that. So wherever the new administration, and again with respect to Mexico, maybe in the automobile sector, as President Trump or President-elect Trump has already indicated that action may happen, I think we should be very, very clear that this is unacceptable. That not only we will act at the WTO, that obviously should be the first instance where we intervene to launch a case at the WTO for violation of rules, but that we stand ready to also exercise our trade might and not be passive. The last point I want to raise is with respect to the exchange rate. You said, Adam, and again I agree, you sort of made this timing. First, there may be only trade measures with respect to Mexico, but what will happen is also in the macroeconomic area, there's going to be an increase of public expenditure, of deficits, and then we may get the Federal Reserve down the line to react, and we are back to the mid-1980s. And I fully agree with that scenario, that it is extremely likely that we are going to see a rise of the dollar, a rise of the US trade deficit, and we know the history. Each time the US trade deficit has been very high, as it was indeed in the mid-1980s, we did observe on the part of Congress, on the part of the president, protectionist measures. Now, I think an interesting element that I've been asking myself, and I'm putting to you in a sense as a question, as you remember very well, and you were involved in those matters, in the mid-80s, we sat around the table, G5, and there were agreements about exchange rates. We had the Plaza Agreement. Now, what will happen this time? So, in a sense, the trade pressure were resolved through an exchange rate realignment. Now, what worries me is that at that time, relations between the different players were rather good relations. And so there was this pressure, but there was the institutional setup to be able to sit down among the leading countries and try to tackle the issue. Now, what happens if now it's both more complicated because there are more players than before. Indeed, there is also China that needs to be taken into account, and other countries, but certainly China. And if there is a deterioration of the mechanisms of the G7, of the G20, if the US administration were to decide in a sense that those are fairly irrelevant institutions, that what matters today is unilateralism. You know, what is being said on Twitter? In a sense, yeah. No, then when in 2 or 3 years, your 2019, 2020, when we reach that point where we have those high dollar and large trade deficit, and we do need to sit around the table to try to diffuse those problems by having an exchange rate realignment discussion, are we going to have a table around which to sit to resolve the problem?
Okay, I will open up to the audience in a minute, but I want to give Adam a quick chance to react to some of the points, and perhaps I can push you on one point, which is specifically, and because it is becoming very concrete, the issue of Mexico. So a 35% tariff imposed on car imports from Mexico would not only not be in line with NAFTA, it would also violate the MFN tariffs that the United States has vis-a-vis the rest of the world in the car industry, where we just looked up the numbers. It's 2.5%, actually much lower than in the EU. The MFN tariffs in the EU are 10%. So you would, in fact, at that moment, the United States at that moment would be in violation of WTO rules. And it would directly affect, as André said, a number of European companies. By the way, not only European, also Japanese companies and so on. So what is the reaction taking into account what you said on fighting fire with fire or with water? I mean, I wasn't sure I really fully got what you meant with that metaphor. I mean, is it more a psychological statement that someone who bullies needs to get a face-saving deal. So we move, let's say BMW, move some little factory that doesn't cost much to the US to make a nice Twitter line, and then we stick to the status quo. Is that sort of the face-saving side of it, or is it much more profound that you would say the only thing to be done is normal WTO procedures, which take 3 years until anything gets really fundamentally decided. In these 3 years, those factories are being wiped out in Mexico, and we are in a totally different volume. So perhaps you can react a bit more concretely on this Mexico example.
Yeah, thank you very much, Guntram, and thank you, Minister Yu and Professor Sapir, for your very thoughtful comments. Let me give a couple quick responses to that and then link it back to Mexico. So Mr. Yu was talking about the checks and balances in the U.S., among many other good points. I unfortunately have to throw water on that in two ways. I hope that's right, okay? But two cautions. The first is, as my colleague Gary Huffbauer documented, the American president at present has extraordinary executive order powers, meaning things that she or he, in this case he, can change by just writing a pen without congressional approval. Essentially, if it doesn't require additional expenditures from Congress or tax cuts, the president can do it. So sometimes this has been used for very nice things, like most of the environmental agreements between the US and China were done by executive order by President Obama because there was no way in hell any of them would get through Congress. But of course, this underscores the precedent that had already started under Bush and Cheney, and before that the president has a huge amount of executive power. Almost everything, not everything, but almost everything to do with trade and foreign investment fits under this executive power. So even if there are normal checks and balances, at some point, of course, Congress can kick in. And in particular, the biggest exception is something that is an actual treaty, like NAFTA. The president cannot immediately overturn. But almost everything short of that in the trade arena, the president can do by executive authority very quickly. He can even essentially, and my colleague Huffbauer spells this out very carefully, he can even essentially suspend compliance with NAFTA temporarily, claiming an emergency for legal purposes. So the check and the balance eventually becomes, does Congress, do the American people wake up and say this is bad? And then pass legislation to change the powers or to prevent that or put pressure on him. But legally he can do it. Which is the second thing I wanted to pick up from Minister Yu. He quite rightly, I think, talks about the contradictions between the various goals that Mr. Trump has professed, including the trade agenda I mentioned, and that's absolutely right. And this reflects the underlying realities of economics and international diplomacy, that there's a reason why 50, 60 years of American administrations have not pursued this path, because it does lead to these kinds of contradictions. However, mistakes get made. You can do something bad and it takes you a while before people agree and recognize it. I mean, in a sense, this is the more, let's call it technocratic version of what I was saying earlier about the business people in the administration saying, well, we don't really want trade wars, it's all just for posture. Similarly, there is a group of perfectly responsible, qualified Republicans in Washington who are expecting that, you know, to use the term, parental guidance will be needed at some point. And whether it's in 1 year, 2 year, or 3 years, at some point, there will be a recognition of folly, and the Trump administration will invite in people who contributed to the multilateral system and understand how the game is really played, et cetera, et cetera. I hope this is correct, okay? And this then gets into the big strategic issues, and I'll get back to Guntram in a second. I'll try to be quick. About, do you, in a sense, maybe it's good if you blow things up and are actually fight fire with fire and make the cost very high and very obvious very quickly, because then maybe the Trump administration either comes to a realization or is forced to change course. So I didn't mention that because for a variety of reasons, I don't think that's the way to go. But if you start down this path, which is a perfectly legitimate way of thinking about it, then there is even an argument that the U.S. should be hit back at as strongly as possible, as quickly as possible, so they feel the pain, and Trump is forced to turn around. We're on the 100th anniversary of the U.S. entry into World War I. This is not necessarily, to me, the right model. But anyway, let's just leave it at that. Andre, as always, I mean, he and I agree on a lot, but he is far more sophisticated about trade than I am, whereas I am channeling my colleagues at Peterson. Has a very good specific vision and talks about what it means to be part of the rule-based system, and I particularly like the idea that you can be in favor of the rules-based system without being for every current rule, and that one of the problems of not having Doha, just as not having TPP, is the rules that were in the WTO or the rules that were in NAFTA have not been updated. And I think that's a very important point. And then the exchange rate story that you mentioned and why it might be more difficult to get agreement now than it was 30 years ago. Again, I fully agree with that. What I just want to pick up from Andre, which goes into Guntram's point, and I'll get to Mexico, is what I think has to happen. When I say fighting fire with water, I really mean two things. I mean not escalating matters. I mean trying to keep things sectioned off. So even if you have a toddler who is screaming and insistent on having cookies for breakfast and is breaking very nice plates in your kitchen to have cookies for breakfast, you might send the toddler to the corner for a bit, but you're not going to send the toddler out of the house. I hope the analogy is clear.
The problem is you are not the daughter, you're the mother, you know? That's the problem.
Well, no, but I mean, but I mean, as shepherds of the system, that's essentially the spirit in which I mean it.
Right.
You again, you can make the argument it's better to retaliate hard. I don't think that will work with this crowd. I don't think the history of doing that is very good. It's to keep it limited, keep it sectioned off, keep it going. And the second thing, not so much psychological, but I think rhetorical.
Right.
Which is, I think the high road Mr. Xi took in Davos, I think, was very fine. I think that was a great speech. And, you know, that's the way to say it, is you know, we benefited from globalization. You can even go further and say, you benefited from our benefiting from globalization. You know, having 1 billion people emerge from poverty is a moral victory for the world and is good for the US, okay? But we should not be getting like the Brexiteers have with EU and get into this person's a drunk and this person's a Nazi and this person's a this and this person's a that. Right. There will be great temptation to do so. There will be great provocation to do so, but not. So finally, Mexico. I completely agree with Guntram, with this, Andre. You know, this is going to be a violation. It's going to directly hit European auto industry. It's going to directly hit Japanese auto industry. It's going to directly hit US auto industry. It is pretty much insane to mess with the global supply chain in North America. So we had the spectacle of the other day of Toyota had announced that they were going to build a new auto plant, $1 billion, in northern Mexico. This would be the first new investment of that scale in autos in North America since before the financial crisis. Mr. Trump attacked it, okay? This is lunacy, okay? This is beyond, I need stuff in my country, not in your country. This is getting into Russian, if my cow dies, I want your cow to die just because I don't want anyone to have a cow if I can't have one. The way to think about this in Mexico, frankly, is for everyone but the U.S. and the U.S. companies on the sly, frankly, to realize that at a 15% exchange rate loss, Mexico is a bargain, that the jobs and factories being moved into the U.S. are, as you suggested, little symbolic things for the toddler, and have no real meaning, and that the underlying economic logic of this supply chain, which is based on technology, remains. And so there will be losses over a 2 to 3 year horizon if it takes that long to go through the WTO or whatever. But, you just got to view it like you do a financial crisis or a storm. View it as an investment opportunity. And I think it's useful for both the government of Mexico and the auto industry to think about it that way.
Okay, so let me open up to the audience. There's a question here, then the gentleman there, and then the gentleman here. That's the first three. You can take three, no? Three in a row.
Sure. I write it down.
Catherine Fiore, reporter. Can I just ask, I assume that TTIP in any shape or form is dead and buried for the foreseeable future. And I just wondered what you think the prospects of a British deal with the US are. I mean, okay, they can get a deal, but what sort of a deal do you think that they can get? Thank you.
Hi, Alan Beattie from the Financial Times. There's a third area, apart from exchange rates and trade, in which the Trump administration seems to be keen in what it regards as levelling the playing field, which is tax, and particularly this potential for a border adjustment tax.
Right.
Just skipping lightly over the virtues of that, I'm just wondering to what extent do people think that will, as it were, draw the sting of protectionism from the other two parts of the package?
And there was here, Lars.
Thank you, Lars Horvath, formerly with the Commission. Thanks for a good analysis and run-through. I tend to more or less agree with you that we shouldn't expect that much of a difference. We saw that after the election, everybody said, well, that was campaign mode, and now things are going to settle down. There's going to be bringing together. That certainly hasn't happened, and I don't see why it should happen in terms of his approach. You already answered the first question, which I was going to ask, in terms of the formal executive powers that the president has. My second question is more about Congress, and that is that these policies in terms of trade are fundamentally un-Republican. They're totally against what Republicans have said for so many years. It's more in the Democratic Party mode, but I don't imagine that the Democrats are going to come around and support his trade policy immediately. So how long is it going to last, if we can call it that, the kind of a honeymoon with the Republican Congress, the dominated Congress, and these clear un-Republican approaches that we might fear? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's take those three.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah, so in terms of TTIP, again, as you said rightly, I don't want to say dead and buried, but it is in suspension. The commissioner and her now gone counterpart, USTR Mike Froman, issued a good document, I think, last week, summarizing how far they went, and I think it's a perfectly good grounds for building on in future. And given that tariffs and other things are already so low between U.S. and Europe, if TTIP, more than any other trade deal, if it's postponed, can be picked off where it left off, and I wouldn't sweat it that much. I don't, obviously I'm not happy it's been postponed, more because of the reasons it's getting postponed. The proposals being made about replacing the ISDS provisions with some kind of multinational tribunal might actually be a help, both in substance and politics, and so if a postponement leads to that change, that might even be good. So of all the many things in the world, with nothing against TTIP, that's the one I'm least worried about if it just put on pause, because I think there's a perfectly good basis for moving forward when it happens. Thanks to Alan Beattie, who's known me for a long time, for showing up, since he could have just as easily skipped. But he actually makes exactly the right point, which the thing that I didn't mention, which is sort of silly I didn't mention it, is the border tax adjustment proposal. So I don't want to waste a lot of time recapping.
No, but I think please explain, because I think
exactly.
not everybody knows.
So the part of the reason it's stupid for me not to have mentioned it is because that's actually the number one priority the Pearson Institute's working on at the moment. There will be a live webcast of our whole analysis of it on February 1st, if you're interested. And there's a lot on our website about it. Anyway, the basic idea is the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives, which is running economic policy at the moment, has a tax proposal that says We are going to cut corporate taxes enormously, but supposedly broaden the base. We're going to cut estate or inheritance taxes. We're going to do a few other tax cuts. We can't say that this is revenue neutral, even though we will claim that this has positive dynamic effects on the U.S. economy. We have to make up the revenue someplace else. Yes, let's do a border adjustment tax. What is the border adjustment tax or border tax adjustment, depending on which acronym you like better? I prefer it BAT as in batty than BTA, but anyway. If we do the border tax adjustment, the idea is we're taking up on the complaints that have been made by U.S. multinationals through the years that the U.S. doesn't have a VAT like every other major trading partner, and therefore this will allow us, given our trade deficit, to collect a lot of revenue, and we will therefore make the Trump administration happy because it will supposedly close the trade deficit as well as raising revenue. And there are a large number of people in the U.S., either out of conviction or because the political winds are so strong, who say, absolutely, the U.S. corporate tax code has to be reformed. And this goes to things like the so-called inversions, when Apple booking all its IPR, intellectual property rights, in low-tax Ireland, or pharmaceutical companies playing games and transfer pricing. Okay. So there is a tax efficiency argument for saying we need a lower corporate tax rate statutorily, more revenue or same revenue in practice, supposedly, and close the loopholes. Was that an okay? Sorry. So that's the sum. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a complicated issue, but I think it comes down very simply to a few things. The first is, if you take it as part of this large package, even if you believe the revenue projections for the border adjustment tax, it will not make up for the enormous revenue losses of the other tax. So the kind of macro scenario that Andre or I were talking about is still going to happen. Very, very large increase in deficits. My running estimate right now is that we will see increases annually of the U.S. fiscal deficit of 1 to 1.5% of GDP a year in an economy that now is over 90% debt to GDP ratio and is at full employment. This is not Greece, this is not good. In the spirit of what the gentleman over here was saying, this reveals, one could argue, the ideology or the hypocrisy of the House Republicans, that no matter how many times corporate tax cuts have not paid for themselves and proven to be low multiplier, they still insist on doing them even though they claim to be fiscal conservatives. All right, leave that aside. Border tax adjustment in its own terms, which is incredibly important. As my colleague Carolyn Freund just published in an op-ed and has the analysis is on our website, this is not a VAT, okay? This is more discriminatory than a VAT. It has additional deductions that mean you are biasing this towards exports and away from imports. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it is an anti-competitive subsidy to exporters and tax on importers in the U.S. It is a regressive tax on U.S. households, and it is totally grounds for other countries to retaliate or complain in the WTO. Full stop. If the U.S. was moving to a VAT, a genuine VAT, that would offer some of the same benefits from a tax efficiency perspective. It would still be horribly regressive, and you would have to try to make that up somewhere else, but this is not a VAT. Second point, there are a bunch of academics, including some very distinguished ones like Martin Feldstein in the Wall Street Journal recently, who tell you, well, what's going to happen is the exchange rate is going to go up to compensate. Right. And therefore, people abroad will not mind, because even though it has the subsidy aspect against imports, de facto, it'll all exchange rate will compensate. This is, in my opinion, this is classic bad thinking by good economists. The way the logic works is, I assume that this tax is neutral for savings versus investment. If it's neutral for savings versus investment, the current account deficit must not change. If the current account deficit must not change and we're having this massive price shift in U.S. exports, the exchange rate must offset to compensate. Right. Therefore, the exchange rate must offset to compensate. Right. Problem. As previously stated, the whole point of the exercise, according to the congressional Republicans, is this will raise revenue. So by definition, It changes the savings minus investment balance, and therefore you cannot say there is a determinate effect on the exchange rate. Additional problem. There is a huge distortion in terms of which industries get affected by this which ways as opposed to which do not. There are a number of non-traded industries that get affected in strange ways, like the education sector, the tourism sector. And so this is not neutral in any sense. So again, the exchange rate will not offset. Third, if the exchange rate does not automatically offset, not only will our trading partners and friends around the world say this is a pure redistribution, attempt to take away our markets and we should retaliate or complain, but it becomes that much more regressive for the US. Because if it is essentially a tax on consumption goods, which imported goods primarily go to, in a country where we don't have a welfare state, this is a shift in taxation incidence from capital owners to workers, full stop. And again, the way that people wave this away is they say, oh, well, the exchange rate will rise, so the workers won't be, and households won't be any worse off. First, that won't help. But second, it's not going to happen. So anyway, Alan Beattie is absolutely right to raise the issue of the border tax adjustment. This is the professed priority of the congressional Republicans as part of their tax package. In typical style, the president-elect 4 or 5 days ago said he thought it was a bad idea. 2 days ago said he thought it was a good idea.
Yeah. So it's all open.
Finally, executive powers in Congress. I'm not partisan. I genuinely am not. I've worked with Republican administrations in the past. So I don't want to really get into this. But the fact is, if you look at recent U.S. history, Congress has generally been supine to the president. You look at the way the Democrats reacted after 9/11 to Bush Cheney. The exception was the Republicans in the second term of Obama. Now, so are they going to act the same on some sort of principle against their newly elected president and titular head of the party? My belief is not. Just a fact for people to consider, if you go to the polling data, and for example, the PIIE people, who are the best sort of nonpartisan independent polling people in the US, they have data showing very clearly that even if Republican Congress people remain pro-free trade, the Republican Party has shifted in terms of members, in terms of voters, anti-free trade. And almost as largely, the Democratic electorate, Democratic capital D, the people who vote for the Democratic Party, have shifted in favor of free trade. So we have this underlying dynamic that there are entrenched Democratic senators and congresspeople who are anti-trade, but their constituents are increasingly for trade, and vice versa on the Republican side. So let me just say, I'm not going to count on a major principled resistance by a large number of Republican congresspeople on this.
Okay, let's take a few more questions. No more questions? Everything? Oh,
I promise I can be briefer.
He's going to be briefer on the next one, but I thought this tax issue is actually important.
Yeah.
It needs some explanation. And then Suman, and then please.
Kurt Geisert, Association of German SMEs. I have also a question for President Posen. You spoke about TTIP in suspense. Will there be a race now? Who will be first, TTIP or a bilateral trade agreement between United States and United Kingdom?
Yes, and again, I apologize to the reporter in the front row. I dropped that. Look.
Let's collect.
Yeah, sorry, please.
Suman and then.
Yes, Adam, the exchange rate has ended up playing quite an important role in this discussion. So what constrains President Trump from intervening directly in FX markets? I know traditionally that's not been seen as compatible with the U.S. concern for the rules of the game, but could that change?
And then John Wayne.
I'm Janwei visiting fellow from Bruegel. I have a very simple question. If there's some, reallocation of U.S. employment towards the manufacturing sector, there will be additional cost for the service sector and also for those employment in the exporting sector, because this is also a very huge sector in the United States. And so what is the U.S. government going to do with those beneficial sectors, I shall say, those sectors which will be the cost of the retaliation policy, maybe from China, from Mexico, or from the other countries, or maybe from the U.S. itself?
Thank you.
But if you don't mind, let's
Of course.
take 2-3 more,
Sure.
and then we wrap it up.
Sure.
So then, Alexander.
Hello, Alex Lehman from Bruegel. So how quickly would this shift of liquid assets of U.S. multinational companies back to the U.S. happen? And will that fix the investment shortfall in the U.S.? And what, if anything, would be the impact on the host economies here in Europe?
Yeah, please.
Christine Hattin, you mentioned protection of IPR as a priority. What do you think of WTO IPR mechanism, or do you see something else for discussing this?
Okay, is there any last question? Otherwise, I would end the questions here and give perhaps all three panelists a chance to react to some of the things they've heard. But Adam, please.
Yeah.
There's one last question.
Oh, can we take one more?
Sure, of course.
So because
Gwilym Jones from the EBRD. If you were sitting in the new administration and looking for some face savers for your president, what would you come up with?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Okay. Okay.
Let me start with the last one. And I'm trying to resist the urge to say, if I was sitting in a new administration, shoot me now. The half-joking response is spend whatever it takes to get Beyonce to play the inaugural. But less jokingly, I mean, he's going to get the tax cuts. Okay, he may not get the border tax adjustment, and I personally, not the Institute, I personally am working, I hope, to keep him from getting the border tax adjustment, because I think it's bad. But anyway, no matter what, they are going to get the big tax cuts. No matter what, he has put enough fear into American, and to a lesser degree foreign multinationals, that he's going to get a lot of these symbolic, Goodwin put it very well, I forget, but basically symbolic little, I move a little plant here, or I pretend that I'm not firing people or something. He doesn't need face saving. Seriously. He needs, face saving is about people in this room and me, and we're the elite, we're the globalists, we're bad. He doesn't need face saving with his voters. He's got no problem. And if he is able to deliver just visibly a few things, he's not going to have a problem. My concern is really the opposite. It's that he's going to have success in face-saving terms, in Twitter terms, and possibly in electoral terms in the 2018 congressional midterms. The problem's not going to be face-saving. The problem is there's not going to be any pressure on him to change. So that would be my take. That may be totally wrong, and this is one of many things I've said today where I would be very happy to be wrong. The gentleman from the Argit, I guess, DEHATE, sorry. Anyway, and the lady who previously had spoken about UK-US. So this is very simple, although Andre may have a lot more to say about it. When the US was doing TPP, the US had an option to tell the UK, TPP is a state-of-the-art 21st century deal. TPP is named TPP, but in the code, it was specifically designed to not be geographically limited. There is a clear accession process. So when US was moving forward with TPP, I'm not saying this was a good idea and good for US-EU relations, but there was a perfectly credible option, as Bob Zellick, the former USTR, pointed out, that you could just say to the UK, we will expedite your application to TPP, you join TPP, done. No, seriously. I mean, and that would have been a process that could credibly have been accomplished within 1 or 2 years and would have a very clear end game and would be perfectly legal, all done. In the absence of the U.S. having an ongoing multilateral round, then as many experts have pointed out, you essentially are starting from ground zero with WTO, and then you have questions of could the UK, has it really exited the EU's rubric? And there are a lot of regulatory issues in financial services and in pharmaceuticals and in taxes, and then you got a whole mess. So, I think, again, for symbolic purposes, there will be some gesture towards the UK. And then, as everything has been the case for decades in US-UK relations, the UK thinks it has a special relationship, and the US thinks it has another country that likes it and it can abuse. And remember, I'm a former Bank of England official, okay? So it's not because I don't like the UK. Suman, FX, what constrains intervention in markets? Well, actually nothing, Suman, except, as you say, precedent. So I think you're aware, my colleagues Fred Bergston and Joe Gagnon have made a very sustained and serious argument that the way to deal with currency manipulators of any kind is the U.S. ultimately should engage in what they call countervailing currency intervention, essentially tit-for-tat reaction. Now, there are technical questions with China. If you have a non-free traded currency, how do you do that? But the point is there are serious people out there who say that the U.S. should be ready to engage. And legally, there's nothing to prevent the U.S. from doing so. I mean, in theory, there is this process by which the U.S. Treasury declares somebody a manipulator. And thanks in part to Joe and Fred, there is actually now a serious definition of what constitutes manipulation, which I would note does not apply to China right now and hasn't for some time, but there is a serious definition. But as with all these things, in the spirit of what I'm saying, the American president has lots of powers and could just ignore that and just do it anyway. Now, there are costs to doing this, as you're well aware, and I think we would all be better off, including the U.S., if you built on what former Undersecretary Lael Brainerd and outgoing Undersecretary Nathan Sheets of the U.S. Treasury did, which was build agreements in the G20 and the G7 not to engage in unilateral currency intervention, which seemed to have held up and, for example, restrained the Japanese government from engaging in currency intervention for several years now. That would be better. Just like it would be better if you're worried about tax evasion, instead of doing unilateral border tax adjustment, you made something real out of BEPS, right? It would be better. But there's nothing to keep the American president from doing that if he or she chooses to. Reallocation of manufacturing labor, I'm not quite sure what to say. The two things I would say is, first, as has been discussed with regard to this famous paper about the China shock by Otto, Dorn, and Hansen, what that paper reveals is not so much that China was huge trade shock, although it was, but the U.S. labor market is very dysfunctional at reallocating workers. And there are many ways of seeing this, and despite the fact that the U.S. is supposed to have this wonderful liberated labor market, actually, labor market mobility has gone down in the U.S. compared to Europe. Labor market participation has gone down in the U.S. compared to Europe. Mm-hmm. There's something fundamentally wrong with the U.S. labor market. Now, part of that is our tax code and Republicans who won't vote for any labor adjustment programs. So if this happens, as you said, and there's major reallocation, I don't expect the U.S. government to be of much help. The second point is just to remember the numbers. I'm sure you're aware of them, but let's be very clear. Nicola, I think, can correct me because his memory is better than mine. But roughly speaking, manufacturing share of employment in U.S. GDP is 12%. Mm-hmm. I mean, its share of employment? Yeah. It's 12%. GDP is higher because, of course, it's high value added. It's roughly 12%. We've done some back of the envelope calculations. Maximum amount you could possibly get that up to if you did everything you could to subsidize and push up employment in the manufacturing sector would be 15%. Mm-hmm. So, again, I don't want to trivialize that, but you're moving 3% of the workforce. This is not the end of the world. Alex, how quickly could they shift to, the investment shortfall and the taxes, right? So the deal, if the U.S. Congress does pass a tax holiday in return for so-called repatriation of assets, remember that they don't literally repatriate the assets necessarily. They have to convert them to dollars. But what they're really doing is they're just being labeled as U.S. assets rather than foreign assets. So there are, depending how you estimate it, somewhere between $2 and $2.5 trillion of U.S. multinationals' assets held abroad. There are widely differing estimates of how much of that is for real good reasons versus how much of that is tax evasion, transfer pricing, game playing. Presumably the stuff that's held abroad for real good reasons wouldn't move, or at least some of it wouldn't move. So order of magnitude, the amount that would move is, say, between 1.5 and 2 trillion. Okay, it's still a huge number. However, the last time the US did this, which was in 2004, the vast majority of the money that came home was given out in dividends, share buybacks, and so on. There was no noticeable bump in corporate investment at the time. So we don't know. In terms of speed, if it gets passed by Congress, it would be usually a 12-month period for companies to move it back. Whether the 12-month period starts at the end of calendar year 2017 or starts with passage of the legislation sometime in June or August, I don't know. But roughly speaking, the process would take place over the course of 2018. Protective IPR priority mechanism, let me defer to Andre on that. I know nothing about that. I just know it's an issue. EBRD, face savers, I already responded to that. I was hilarious. Okay, fine.
Yeah, okay. Okay, let's give our two other panelists also a chance to react very quickly to some points, please.
Okay, just now Mr. Posen has something very pessimistic future for China-U.S. trade relations.
Hope not.
But I do think that China-U.S. economically are so much interdependent. And we have done a study, if United States, have 45 import tariffs on China, the United States GDP will go down by 1.1%.
Yep.
And that also is a lot. So I do believe that the president will be quite reasoning to make any decisions, and also for the rest of other countries. So, and China still holds the hope that we were not going to trade war with the United States, and we are ready to negotiate with the new administration, as well as to sit down to negotiate for a new international trade mechanism and the WTO framework. And so President Xi has proposed this idea in Davos, and I hope his message will be correctly transmitted to Washington. Maybe tomorrow, Mr. Trump will have clear understanding of China's intention, and so that we can find solutions for these troubles. Maybe in history we have so many troubles with American administrations, especially the newly elected presidency. I still remember that in 1993, most favored nations issue was a very hot issue at that time, but finally the two sides solved all these issues peacefully. So we cannot say a trade war is coming, but we can say we are doing something to avoid it. Thank you very much.
Great. Andre?
Yeah, let me try to give a sort of political economy reading of this, and maybe also a conclusion which is not overly pessimistic. No, I mean, I've been trying to understand why Trump has taken the stance that he has in the campaign about trade in a time when the unemployment situation is not bad at all. Okay? So it can be, he can be talking to the median voter about a job, maybe about wages, but not about the job. Now, on the other hand, he, I think, was talking to the median voters in the key states. And which I think has been the element, right? The element that made him win the election is the fact that he was able to take some of those states, including Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that normally would have voted on the Democratic side. And those are clearly states that are the Rust Belt states. So I think indeed he has been talking to not the American worker, to the American manufacturing worker and the old manufacturing worker, indeed, okay, or the old sectors. Now, there I think what can he do? It's not going to be easy, right? I mean, what we see is that the US manufacturing output over time has not been declining. Okay? What has been declining is manufacturing employment. Okay? And not only there's not been a trend, but even if you look at the crisis, the US manufacturing output, which is not the case in Europe, by the way, US manufacturing output is back to above where it was in 2007. In Europe, it's not the case. We never recovered the pre-crisis level in terms of manufacturing output. Okay? So the US has recovered very well. Manufacturing output has been kept, but manufacturing employment in a steady manner has been going on. Now, there's not much you can do. I mean, why has manufacturing employment gone down? I would think mostly for technological reasons, but I think the trade part has played a role probably, and Mexico indeed, delocalization has happened. So, okay, you can get some jobs back from there, but I don't think very, very much. So my hope, and I will end with this, and maybe we disagree a little bit on that from the discussion we had before, my hope is that he's going to be serious about his infrastructure plan. And that the jobs in the old manufacturing, they will come mostly. So he will create jobs in the manufacturing sector, but it will come mostly from the investment, from the infrastructure. And some will come because he will scare some US investor to repatriate, like Ford, but that I think will be minor. So he will make a lot of noise on trade, will create jobs, but the creation of jobs will come from the other side. And in the end, he will go back. He will be able to go back to those electors and say, "I have fulfilled my promise, but at relatively low cost on the trade side." That's my hope.
Okay, please join me in thanking Adam and all our three speakers.